In this presentation, we will discuss school food service meal patterns as they relate to the school breakfast program. The Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act requires school meals to reflect the recommendations of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. These science-based standards are set to ensure schools are providing wholesome meals that will optimize health and academic achievement. Memo SFS 19-27, the final rule, updated the meal patterns and nutrition standards for the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs. This rule requires most schools to increase the availability of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and fat-free and low-fat fluid milk in school meals, to reduce the levels of sodium, saturated fat, and trans fat in meals, and meet the nutrition needs of children within their caloric requirements. These improvements to the school meal programs, largely based on recommendations made by the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies, were expected to enhance the diet and health of school children and help mitigate the childhood obesity trends. The National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program requirements are designed to provide age-appropriate meals to specific age grade groups. For K-12, dietary specifications for calories, sodium, and saturated fat are in place to limit the risk of chronic disease. Let's look at a brief overview of the general requirements for breakfast. Meals are based on a food-based menu planning approach. This approach simplifies menu planning, serves as a teaching tool to help children choose a balanced meal, and ensures that students nationwide have access to key food groups recommended by the Dietary Guidelines. Schools use 3 same age grade groups for planning breakfast and lunch: grades K-5, 6-8, and 9-12. Breakfast also has the option to use combined age grade groups, such as K-8 or K-12. These age grade groups provide age-appropriate meals. There are daily and weekly serving requirements for each food component in the meal pattern. There are also daily and weekly dietary specifications for calories, saturated fat, and sodium. In addition, all foods must contain 0 grams of trans fat. Flexibilities. Memo SP 38, 2019, Meal Requirements under the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program, Questions and Answers for Program Operators, is a great resource for program operators who may have specific questions about components or other meal pattern concerns. Memo SFS 19-27 is the final rule, which covers permanent flexibilities for fluid milk, whole grains, and sodium. The final rule allows for low-fat flavored milk to be served in school meals and removes the requirement that flavored milk has to be fat-free. The final rule requires that half of the weekly grains in the school lunch and breakfast menu be whole grain rich, thus ending the need for the exemption process. And finally, the final rule extends the timeline for sodium reduction in school meals. By codifying these changes, USDA acknowledges the persistent menu planning challenges experienced by some schools and affirms its commitment to give schools more control over food service decisions and greater ability to offer wholesome and appealing meals that reflect local preferences. First, we will need to distinguish 2 important terms: food components and food items. A food component is one food group that contributes to a reimbursable meal. All components are required to be offered at their respective meals in order for the meals to be reimbursable. The food components for breakfast are fruit, grains, and fluid milk. Food items, on the other hand, are a specific food within a food component. For example, a muffin is a food item within the grains component. Let's dive into the school breakfast meal pattern requirements. This slide provides an overview of the school breakfast pattern. Each breakfast must contain daily and weekly amounts of 3 components: grains, fruits, and milk. The minimum daily requirements are the same for all 3 grade groups: K to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 12. 1 ounce equivalent of grains, 1 cup of fruit, and 1 cup of milk, which must be low-fat or fat-free, unflavored, or flavored. The weekly requirements for the age grade groups are different, however, as we will see in the upcoming slides. Here we see the daily and weekly minimum requirements of the fruit, grain, and milk components by age grade group for breakfast. Please note that at breakfast there are 5 possible age grade groups to use: K to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 12, K to 8, or K to 12. The fruit component, which may include vegetables, is a minimum of 1 cup per day for every age grade group. The grain component, which may include meat alternate, is 1 ounce equivalent per day. However, the weekly minimums vary by age grade group. This chart shows the weekly requirements for a 5-day school week. Fluid milk is also the same for each age grade group, requiring 1 cup of milk from a choice of milks per day. Here we also see in the school breakfast meal pattern calorie ranges, the acceptable saturated fat percentage, and the sodium limits for each age grade group. Calories for K to 5 must be within 350 to 500 calories. 6 to 8 must be between 400 and 550 calories, and for 9 to 12 it must be between 450 and 600 calories. If using a combined age grade group for breakfast, K to 8 meals must be within 400 to 500 calories, and K to 12 must be within 450 and 500 calories. Saturated fat is consistent among the age grade groups and is based on less than 10% of the calories from the meal coming from saturated fat. Sodium varies between the traditional age grade groupings, but follow the K to 5 age grade restrictions when using a combined pattern such as for K to 8 or K to 12. Fruit is a required component in both breakfast and lunch. Schools may offer fruits that are fresh, frozen, dried, or canned in light syrup, water, or fruit juice. Pasteurized, full-strength fruit juice may also be offered to meet up to 1/2 of the fruit components over the week. The meal patterns specify the required quantities for fruit in each age grade group. Fruit and gelatin may not credit unless visible fruit is also present in the gelatin. Dried fruit credits as twice the volume of the fruit. For example, 1/4 cup of raisins credit as 1/2 cup of fruit. Fruit juice must be pasteurized, 100% full-strength juice, and can either be from concentrate or not from concentrate. How do you know that juice is 100%? Look for the name on the label to include the words juice, full-strength juice, 100% juice, reconstituted juice, or juice from concentrate. Juice concentrates can be used only when reconstituted with water to 100% full-strength juice and can be credited in the forms of liquid or frozen juice only. Therefore, juice cannot credit towards the fruit component when used as an ingredient in other food or beverage products. For example, Gelatin made with juice does not credit as a juice since the fruit juice is no longer in the form of liquid or frozen juice. The Food Buying Guide provides additional crediting information. The weekly juice limit is calculated based on the amount of fruits that students are allowed to select at a given meal, regardless of the number of options or varieties of fruits available. Menu planners must calculate the menu's compliance with the weekly juice limit separately for fruits by dividing the total weekly amount of fruit juice that students can select by the total weekly fruit offerings. When calculating the total amount of juice that students can select, menu planners must count all sources of 100% fruit juice served during the week. This includes juice that is fresh, frozen, or made from concentrate, frozen juice pops made from 100% fruit juice, and pureed fruits or vegetables in the fruit vegetable smoothies. Canned fruit and light syrup or water does not count towards the weekly juice limit. What does it look like for half of the fruit component to be met by juice over the course of a week? In this instance, each day the SFA offers a half a cup of fruit in the form of applesauce and other whole and canned fruit items, as well as half a cup of fruit juice. This is equal to 2.5 cups of whole fruit over the course of a week and 2.5 cups of juice over the course of a week. In this scenario, the SFA is offering 50% of the fruit component as juice over the week. The juice limit requirement applies to both breakfast and lunch. Smoothies containing milk may credit as long as the manufacturer adequately documents how the product meets federal meal requirements through a product formulation statement or child nutrition label. This includes attesting that commercial mixes with milk are made using ingredients that meet federal, state, and local requirements. School food service staff must ensure that the required 8 ounces of fluid milk is available to each child served and that at least one other unflavored, fat-free, or low-fat milk is offered to meet the variety requirement for school meals. There are specific crediting requirements for smoothies, which can either be pre-made or made to order. If smoothies consist of pureed fruits and vegetable mixed with milk, it must also be low-fat or fat-free unflavored or flavored. The milk may credit towards the fluid milk requirement if it is a full serving. Amounts less than 1 cup do not credit. When smoothies are offered, the fluid milk component must also be offered to meet the variety milk requirement. Pureed fruits and vegetables in school-made smoothies credit only as juice in the daily and weekly meal pattern requirements. Crediting is based on the actual volume of pureed fruits and vegetables per serving as documented by the standardized recipe. Menu planners must count pureed fruits and vegetables in beverages with all other juices towards the weekly juice limit. F&S also allows for the crediting of yogurt in smoothies as a meat alternate for all meals and snacks. It is important for program operators to recognize that the addition of yogurt to a smoothie does not serve as a substitution for fluid milk. Fluid milk must be offered to meet the milk component requirement. Effective with the final rule, smoothies containing yogurt are no longer required to be prepared in-house and may credit as long as the manufacturer adequately documents how the product meets federal meal requirements. This includes attesting that yogurt in commercial mixes are made in compliance with federal definitions for yogurt. The school meal regulations require schools to identify the food components offered to students. Schools serving smoothies should inform students about the components included by listing the type of smoothie on the menu and serving line signage, such as strawberry and yogurt smoothie. Vegetables can be used as a substitution for fruit in the breakfast meal pattern. Per USDA's memo SP 06-2020, released January 22, 2020, starchy vegetables are allowed in place of fruit at breakfast without including vegetables from another subgroup in the weekly menu. This substitution continuation is allowed through June 30, 2021. Vegetable juice counts towards 50% of the weekly juice limit. Vegetables can be offered as extra items for breakfast as long as they fit within the weekly dietary specifications. In addition, vegetables that are offered as extras do not count as a food item in offer versus serve. For example, if a student chooses the extra vegetable served, they must have 3 other breakfast items on their tray for a reimbursable meal, including at least a half a cup of fruit. Menu planners should use the USDA Food Buying Guide for Child Nutrition Programs to determine how to credit different items within their component groups. For example, how do you know how much of an orange to serve to provide half of a cup of fruit? 1 orange is not necessarily a half cup of fruit. It depends on the size of the fruit. The Food Buying Guide tells us that a 138 count orange equals a half a cup of fruit, and a 125 count orange or a 113 count orange equals 5/8 cup of fruit. The Food Buying Guide also tells us that there are no whole oranges that provide 1 full cup of fruit. Grain requirements. Regardless of the age grade group being served, at least 1 ounce equivalent of grain must be offered daily. In addition, there are weekly requirements that must be met for each age grade group served. For K to 5, a minimum of 7 ounce equivalent must be offered per week. For 6 to 8, a minimum of 8 ounce equivalent must be offered per week. And for 9 to 12, a minimum of 9 ounce equivalent must be offered per week. The weekly serving of grains at breakfast is determined by adding the ounce equivalents of all daily offerings. Menu planners must calculate the weekly total based on the smallest grain serving offered each day. For example, if the menu offers 2 daily grain choices that include a 1/2 ounce equivalent item and a 2 ounce equivalent item, the menu planner must count the 1/2 ounce equivalent item toward the weekly total. It is important to review all grain choices over the week for compliance with the minimum weekly requirements. When offering different serving sizes of grains or meat alternates each day or over the week, menu planners must pay careful attention to the daily choices. The grains component can be the most challenging meal component to understand. Today we will focus on the basic requirements for crediting grains. For all grades, schools must offer a minimum amount of grains daily and weekly. The amounts vary by age grade group. For grades K to 12, at least half of the grains offered over the week must be whole grain rich. The remaining 50% of grains must be enriched and measured in ounce equivalencies using weights and/or volumes found in Exhibit A of the Food Buying Guide. A whole grain rich product must contain 50% or more of whole grains by weight, with any remaining grains being enriched. If meat alternates are substituted for grains in the school breakfast program, the whole grain rich requirement only applies to the actual grains offered. Preschoolers must be offered whole grains at least once per day. An ounce equivalent is one single serving of a grain for the school breakfast program and National School Lunch Program meal patterns. One important factor to remember is that all grain servings by weight do not credit in the same way. For example, it takes more weight for a cinnamon roll to credit as an ounce equivalent than it does for a slice of bread or a bagel. Here is a screenshot of the Exhibit A grain chart, which is part of the Food Buying Guide for Child Nutrition Programs. The ounce equivalencies used for the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program are found in the middle column of this chart. Here is a screenshot of groups C through F of the Exhibit A grain chart. Items in red are considered grain-based desserts. And here is page 3 of the Exhibit A grain chart. Please note that each category has a minimum weight per serving to equal an ounce equivalent of grains. Let's look at an example of using a food label and the Exhibit A grain chart to determine the ounce equivalents in one serving of a biscuit. Per the ounce equivalency chart or Exhibit A grain chart, biscuits fall under Group B. First, we will divide the weight from your package per serving by the weight needed to produce 1 ounce equivalent for that particular grain product. In this example, we will take 58 grams per serving found on the food label, divide it by 28 grams needed to create an ounce equivalent from the Exhibit A chart. This is equal to 2.07 or 2.0 ounce equivalents. One serving of this product is equal to 2 ounce equivalents of grain, credible to the menu. Remember, we always round down to the nearest quarter of a serving. The whole grain rich ounce equivalency chart is only used for commercially prepared grain products. If determining crediting for the grain contained in a standardized recipe, a different process is followed. For instance, in a recipe for bread, if the ingredients listed 2 cups of whole wheat flour and 2 cups of enriched flour, the recipe would meet the whole grain rich requirement, assuming there are no other grains in the product. What are whole grains? Whole grains are grains that consist of the entire kernel, including the starchy endosperm, the fiber-rich bran, and the germ. Whole grains are nutrient-rich, containing vitamins, minerals, fiber, and antioxidants. All grains start out as a whole grain, but many are processed to remove the bran and the germ, which also removes many of the nutrients. How do you determine whether a grain is a whole grain? Labeling and advertising is often confusing and misleading, making people think that many foods are whole grain when they are not. Careful label reading is needed. If a grain is listed in the ingredient statement without the word whole, the product might not be whole grain. For example, corn, rye flour, and wheat flour. The menu planner must obtain additional information from the manufacturer to determine if grains with these terms are whole grains. If you see whole corn or whole rye flour and whole wheat flour, you know it is a whole grain. If you don't see the word whole, you will need additional documentation from your manufacturer to determine if these grains are whole. SFAs can use the following simple checklist to evaluate if a grain product meets the 50% portion of the whole grain rich criteria. Evaluate a grain product using the following two elements developed by the National Academy of Medicine. Element 1, a serving of the food item must provide at least 1/4 ounce equivalent of grain as defined by Exhibit A found in the Food Buying Guide. And Element 2, foods must meet at least one of the following. 1. The whole grains per serving must be greater than or equal to 8 grams. This may be determined by information provided on the product packaging or by the manufacturer. Also, if a grain product contains a meat alternate, manufacturers may apply for a CN label to indicate the ounce equivalent of grains in a food product. Or, number 2, the product includes one of the following FDA-approved health claims, such as diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers. Or, diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in saturated fat and cholesterol may help reduce the risk of heart disease. And number 3, whole grains are the first item listed on the product ingredient list, with the exception of water. Documentation that may also be used as acceptable whole grain documentation can be a product formulation statement on manufacturer letterhead or a standardized recipe. Product formulation statements are developed by manufacturers to provide specific information about their products. They generally include a detailed explanation of what the product contains and the amount of each ingredient in the product by weight. Unlike CN labels, there is no standard information required for the product formulation statements. Also, they are not approved or monitored by USDA, and they do not provide any warranty against audit claims for reimbursable meals. Product formulation statements are available for many types of food products. CN labels are only for meat and meat alternate products, but can include information on grains, fruits, and vegetables if they are part of the meat alternate product. In summary, to determine if the product is whole grain rich, the product must contain either 100% whole grain or at least 50% whole grain, with the remaining amount being enriched. All grains that aren't whole grain rich must be from enriched grains. Enriched grains or refined grains and grain products that have vitamins and minerals added to replace the nutrients lost during processing. Enriched products are not nutriently equivalent to whole grain products because enrichment does not replace all the nutrients, fiber, and other health-enhancing substances originally present in the whole grain. Enriched grains have 5 nutrients added within limits specified by the Food and Drug Administration: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, and iron. We won't go into too much detail here, but there is also a limit for non-creditable grains. Only whole and enriched grains are creditable. Non-creditable ingredients cannot credit toward the grain component or the whole grain rich requirement. If grain products included these ingredients, they must be present at levels less than 2% of the product formula for the product to meet the whole grain rich definition. Using meat as a grain in the school breakfast program. The breakfast meal pattern does not require meat alternates. However, menu planners can choose to offer meat alternates as a grain substitution after offering the minimum daily grain requirement, which is 1 ounce equivalent. 1 ounce equivalent of meat alternate substitutes for 1 ounce equivalent of grains. A minimum of 1/4 ounce equivalent must be served to count towards the total requirements. Meat alternate substitutions offered in amounts less than 1/4 ounce equivalent are not included in the calculation of daily and weekly grain offerings. There are two options for crediting meat alternates served at breakfast. First, offering a serving of meat alternate in place of a serving of grains as long as 1 ounce equivalent of grains is also served. For this option, the meat alternate counts with grains towards the weekly grain requirement. Meat alternates offered in place of grains count as grain food items in offer versus serve. Second, offering a serving of meat alternate as an extra food that does not count towards the weekly grain requirements. Meat alternates offered as extras do not count as a food item for offer versus serve. For both options, meat alternates must count towards the weekly dietary specifications. Meat alternate products without binders or extenders credit based on the serving weight. However, products with binders and extenders credit based on the actual amounts of meat. These products require a product formulation statement, a child nutrition label, or specific information from the food buying guide on the specific meat products you are using. These are your best resources for determining accurate crediting of meat and meat alternate items. The fluid milk requirements are the same for both breakfast and lunch and are consistent across age grade groups from kindergarten through 12th grade. It is required that schools offer 1 cup of milk at each meal daily. Schools must offer students a variety of fluid milk. Schools may offer fat-free and low-fat milk as part of the reimbursable meal for children grades K to 12. If schools offer flavored milk, unflavored milk must also be offered at each meal service. Preschool students who are not commingled must be offered unflavored milk only. Milk substitutions are required for children with disabilities based on a medical statement from a recognized medical authority. In Louisiana, this is a medical doctor, nurse practitioner, or physician's assistant. A note from a nurse does not qualify in the state of Louisiana. These substitutions do not need to meet the meal pattern requirements for milk. Schools have the option to offer milk substitutions for children without disabilities based on a written statement from a parent or guardian. If a school chooses to allow milk substitutions for children without disabilities, they must offer one or more of the following: either lactose-free or lactose-reduced milk, or non-dairy milk substitutes that meet the USDA nutrition standards for fluid milk substitutions. Milk substitutes must meet the USDA nutrition standards for fluid milk. They must also be included in the weekly averages for the dietary specifications. Schools should have a written policy for milk substitutions that is communicated to parents. Implementation of this policy must be consistent throughout the district. A frequent finding on administrative reviews or technical assistance visits is the service of water or juice as a milk replacement where children do not have a medical statement on file. Juice and water cannot be offered as milk substitutes for non-disabled children because they do not have the same nutritional value as milk. This chart shows the dietary specifications for breakfast. These are based on the weekly average of a 5-day week. In addition to complying with the meal pattern components, schools must also meet the 4 dietary specifications: limits on calories, saturated fat, sodium, and trans fat. This is intended to improve the consistency of meals with the dietary guidelines and the dietary reference intakes. The nutrition standards must be met on an average over the school week. This means that the levels of calories, saturated fat, and sodium in any one meal could exceed the standard as long as the average over the week meets the standard. There are separate standards for both breakfast and lunch. For example, menu planners may be able to offer a meal or food that is relatively high in saturated fat or sodium at some point during the week, if meals with lower to moderate saturated fat or sodium content are offered the rest of the week. However, for trans fat, all food products and ingredients used daily must contain 0 grams of trans fat per serving. Saturated fat. Average weekly meals must limit saturated fat to less than 10% of calories at both breakfast and lunch. Schools are not required to meet a total fat standard. The dietary guidelines emphasize the type of fat consumed is more important than the total fat in terms of preventing diet-related disease, such as heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Why are we concerned about children's saturated fat intake? Saturated fat, in particular trans fat, have the most negative health consequences, which is why the USDA dietary specifications focus on reducing these 2 types of fat. The next standard is for sodium. This chart summarizes the required sodium reductions at breakfast and lunch. You can see the gradual phase-in of the 3 targets for each grade group. The first sodium target took effect on July 1st, 2014. The second sodium target takes effect July 1st, 2024. Non-creditable foods are foods and beverages that cannot credit towards the USDA meal patterns for school nutrition programs. Schools and institutions may serve non-creditable foods in addition to the meal components to add variety, help improve acceptability in the meal, and satisfy appetites. Some examples include maple syrup on pancakes, salad dressing on salads, and condiments such as ketchup or mustard on a hot dog sandwiches and other entrees. Menu planners should limit non-creditable foods in the school menu. These foods often contain little nutritional value and are high in fat, sugars, and sodium. Menu planners should read labels and be aware of ingredients in foods and limit the frequency and amounts of less nutritious choices. Non-creditable foods that are often offered as part of a reimbursable meal must be counted towards the weekly dietary specifications. If non-creditable foods are served, they must contain 0 trans fat, and their inclusion cannot cause the menu to exceed the average weekly limits for calories, saturated fat, and sodium. School breakfast program practice exercises. Is this breakfast reimbursable for K-5 age grade group? It contains 1 serving of either 1% white milk or fat-free strawberry milk, a half cup of oatmeal, a half cup of banana, and a half cup of orange juice. Let's look at the K-5 age grade group. For K-5, a minimum of 1 cup of fruit, a minimum of 1 ounce grain, and a cup of milk in variety should be offered. Yes, this breakfast offered for K-5 age grade group did meet the requirements. Is this breakfast reimbursable for the 6 to 8 age grade group? We have 1 cup of milk with a choice between 2 options, and a whole grain breakfast pizza that credits as 1 ounce meat alternate and 1 ounce grain. Let's look at the 6 to 8 age grade group to remind ourselves what the component requirements are. For the 6 to 8 age grade group, we must offer a minimum of 1 cup of fruit, 1 ounce equivalent of grains, and 1 cup of milk in variety. No, we did not meet the meal pattern requirements for 6 to 8 age grade group because we are missing the fruit component. Is this a reimbursable breakfast meal for 9 to 12 age grade group? They offer 1 cup of white milk or fat-free white milk, 1 cup of pineapple tidbits, and waffle sticks that provide 0.5 ounce equivalent of grain. Let's look at the 9 to 12 age grade group to remind ourselves of the component requirements. For 9 to 12, we must offer 1 cup of fruit, 1 ounce equivalent of grain, and 1 cup of milk in variety form. No, this breakfast for 9 to 12 is not reimbursable. They did not provide the 1 ounce grain equivalent requirement. Now let's discuss a few tips for menu planning. Because the crediting requirements are complicated, it is important for schools to ensure that all processed products used on the school menus comply. The procurement process is the best time to address the whole grain rich requirements and ensure that grain products comply with the limit for non-creditable grains. The bid specifications written for items to be used at breakfast are critical to ensure that all products meet school nutrition standards. It is also advisable to include a copy of the USDA product formulation statement for grains so that bidders are aware of the information required to document meal pattern compliance. Truly, procurement is immensely important in ensuring compliant food items for each of the component groups. Carefully written solicitations can help ensure your menu will be compliant. Here are a few suggestions on ways to reduce waste. 1. Menus should reflect student preferences to increase consumption. 2. You can also consider smart lunchroom strategies, such as strategic titling of menu items and where and how they are placed in the serving line. 3. You can allow students to build healthy school meals, such as offering options within the same component, like a bagel or toast for breakfast. 4. Utilizing offer versus serve is another good way to reduce waste. 5. Shared tables are another example. However, remember that you will need LDH approval and a plan in place to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. And 6. Extending lunch periods may also help, as well as offering recess before lunch so children aren't tempted to throw food away to go outside and play. Here are some important final school breakfast program questions. Are all meal components offered daily? Are all minimum daily portions requirements met for the age grade group being served? Are weekly portion requirements met for the grain? This is a frequent finding on the administrative review and technical assistance visits. Does my menu offer no more than 50% of the fruit component in the form of juice? Or at least half of all creditable grains offerings whole grain rich? Or are there at least 2 milk choices offered daily? Signage is an important requirement of the child nutrition programs. Schools must have signage to identify a reimbursable meal to students. Schools are required to, at or near the beginning of the serving line and prior to the point of service, identify all of the food items that constitute a reimbursable meal both at breakfast and lunch. This signage is to help students select foods that make a reimbursable meal in the correct quantities. State agencies and schools can design signage to fit the students, menus, facilities, or layouts. Signage should also be age appropriate, visible, and should at least contain the short version of the non-discrimination statement. Now let's discuss some frequently asked questions about the school breakfast program and components. May schools modify program meals for children whose disabilities restrict their diets? Yes. Schools are required by law and program regulation to make reasonable modification to meals and snacks for students with a disability that restricts their diet. Many meal modifications can be made within the meal pattern. For modifications within the meal pattern, F&S does not require a medical statement. Other students require meal modifications that do not fit within the meal pattern. In situations where a child requires a meal modification that does not fit within the meal pattern, a medical statement by a medical doctor, nurse practitioner, or physician's assistant is required in order for the school meal to be reimbursable. May schools provide menu variations for children who have dietary preferences that are not disabilities? Yes, provided that the variations meet the meal pattern requirements. Schools are encouraged to plan menus that consider students' dietary preferences, including cultural or religious preferences. Which meal patterns apply to preschool students? Schools are encouraged to offer students age-appropriate meals. Schools serving meals to infants and preschool-age children must comply with the meal patterns for infants and preschool-age children. However, when schools serve preschool children and K-5 students together in the same area at the same time, schools have the flexibility to offer a single menu using the K-5 meal pattern. Can schools offer vegetables in place of fruit at breakfast? Yes. Vegetables are not required in the school breakfast program, but schools may choose to offer vegetables in addition to or in place of fruits. Current regulations state that in order to offer starchy vegetables at breakfast, at least 2 cups of red orange, dark green, legumes, and or other vegetable subgroups must also be offered on the menu within that week. How does dried fruit credit towards the meal pattern? Consistent with the dietary guidelines, whole dried fruit and whole dried fruit pieces credit for twice the volume served. The minimum credible portion still remains 1/8 cup. This means that 1/8 cup raisins credits as 1/4 cup fruit. However, 1/16 cup of raisins do not credit as it is below the minimum serving size. Does the juice limit apply daily or over the school week? For grades K-12, this provision limits juice to no more than half of the fruits and vegetables offered over the week. The vegetable and juice limits are assessed separately. Are schools required to serve a whole grain rich item every day? Yes. For preschoolers, it is required to offer a whole grain rich item in at least one meal or snack per day. But for grades K-12 or for preschoolers who are commingled, at least half of the weekly grains must be whole grain rich, and any remaining grains must be enriched. There is no daily whole grain requirement for grades K-12. How are Bran and Germ credited? Schools can now credit Bran and Germ as if they are enriched grains. Bran and Germ can be offered to meet up the half of the weekly requirements. May schools offer water instead of milk? No. Fluid milk is a required component of a reimbursable meal. Program operators must not promote or offer water, juice, or any other beverage as an alternative selection to fluid milk in a reimbursable meal throughout the food service area. Are RCCIs required to offer a milk variety daily? Yes. However, RCCIs that are juvenile detention facilities or correctional facilities serving children in different age grade groups may meet the milk variety requirement over the week rather than daily. For example, an RCCI may offer students flavored non-fat milk on some days of the week and unflavored low-fat milk on other days of the week. What are the minimum volume and weight requirements for meal components? Meat alternate is 0.25 ounce equivalents. Grains is 0.25 ounce equivalents. Fruits or 1/8 of a cup. Vegetables or 1/8 of a cup. And fluid milk is 8 ounces for grades K to 12, 6 ounces for preschool age, which is 3 to 5, or 4 ounces for preschool age, which is 1 to 2. May unrecognizable food ingredients contribute to the meal pattern requirements? For example, carrot puree into a sauce for macaroni and cheese. Yes, pureed foods such as fruits or vegetables may contribute to meal pattern requirements, provided the dish that contains them also provides an adequate amount of recognizable, creditable fruits or vegetables. 1/8 cup minimum recognizable amount.